Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Thiriku AA Wash Processed Kenya from Big Sur Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Big Sur, based out of Shanghai, China. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including our recent review of the Hamasho Barona Gara Sole, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that we did branch out with the coffees that we picked up from Big Sur this time around, which does include this Kenyan coffee. And while a lot of people know that I'm probably a little bit picky when it comes to the Kenyan coffees that we do review on this channel, this is one that I would have been pretty interested in from any coffee roaster that Airworks did bring in, as this one is a pure SL28 coffee. And those are honestly my favorite wash processed Kenyan coffees to review. So even though I would have been interested in reviewing this coffee regardless of which coffee roaster carried it, I was even more interested in reviewing it from Big Sur, given that we did have some really positive experiences with the other coffees that we had from them up to this point. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 58. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, we've mentioned in the past that Big Sur is one of the lightest roasting Chinese-based coffee roasters that we have reviewed on this channel. And even then, in comparison to a lot of the other Asian-based coffee roasters that we have had on this channel, they do still skew on the very light side of things. And this coffee was certainly no exception, as there were quite a few light qualities and characteristics to this coffee as well. So once again, we will say that this one does skew on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was surprisingly impressive, especially given the expectedly Kenyan forward qualities, including the tart red fruits and plenty of brightness with red florality to it as well. But what really set this coffee apart was some excellent fruit sweetness, including a slight cherry fruit chew and plenty of the Kenyan-like stone fruit peachy qualities as well. So this in itself was a very lovely first impression, and I have to full pause and stop right there and say this was the best impression I'd had of any Kenyan coffee this year up to this point by a significant distance, as anytime I'm able to get more of those peachy qualities and characteristics from a Kenyan coffee, I am extremely happy with the way that it turns out. Couple that with the fact that it did have that cherry fruit chew sweetness, which is something that I usually only get from more developed Kenyan coffees. I was just thoroughly blown away by this first impression of this coffee, to the point where I said this is probably a strong contender to be one of my 10 favorite coffees this year, and probably going to be my favorite wash processed Kenyan coffee. So it's going to be interesting to see if that continued to stay the same. As on day 31, we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was a fair bit less impressive this time around, as it did have a little bit of a cucumber-like characteristic to it with a slight vegetal quality as well, giving it a little bit of depth in terms of the red fruit characteristics, just having a little bit more of a red vegetal and also green vegetal quality. Otherwise, it's a little bit more fruit forward, offering plenty of sweetness and clarity with a slight savoriness as well. So this one, not necessarily as good as that first impression, and that kind of made me rethink whether or not this coffee was going to be as good as that first impression did indicate. Day 34 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee does continue to perform well for a Kenyan coffee, as it's cleaner and sweeter than expected for a Kenyan-like coffee, still offering plenty of those Kenyan characteristics to it in a slightly more sugary sense. So it is herbal, it is a little savory, and it is offering more of those red floral qualities to it. So a little bit more straightforward in general. If anything, it's still just performing a little bit above expectations nonetheless. Day 37 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so we pushed it, as we've had great success with pushing Big Sur's coffees 17:1 at 99 Celsius. The coffee wasn't quite as impressive as it had been on that first impression, as this definitely accentuated a lot of the red fruit characteristics, giving it a very strong currant cranberry feel, direct with a slight glimmer of some of these stone fruits after an extended cool down and finish. So I found myself continuing to chase that peachy characteristic that I experienced from that first time around. However, it was just a struggle to grasp that same characteristic from that point going forward. And on this day, I saw a glimmer of it, but even then, nowhere near based off the first impression that we had had. Day 40 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's a little bit better than some of the previous Chemex days we had had up to this point, as it also accentuates plenty of the red fruit qualities and characteristics in a sweeter and better defined sense. The entire tone of the coffee does remain a little bit darker as you'd fully expect, so darker fruit characteristics in terms of the berry qualities to it, in terms of the stone fruit qualities as well, as it does have this kind of berry syrup, berry nectar-like feel, with the stone fruits being a little bit more reminiscent of plums as well. So this was a very nice day, easily the best day I'd had brewing it through the Chemex throughout the entirety of this one. Day 43 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments. And the coffee has been a little bit inconsistent, which is something I've noticed for the most part when it comes to Big Sur's coffees. They can be a little finicky. This is one of those coffee roasters where adjustments do seem to yield significant results with the way that the coffee does turn out, as it's a little less fruit forward than some of the previous days, a little bit more generic this time around with an above average level of sweetness and intensity, but I didn't feel the need to notate too much on this day, as it just didn't seem to have anything that stood out in comparison to the previous days. Day 46 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was back to being very fruit forward, which is so interesting to me. For whatever reason, it seems to perform well in the Chemex when we go lower in the extraction with Big Sur's coffee, so that happened here. Cleaner with plenty of sweetness yet again in a plum tone, and the fruit characteristics also being reminiscent of that berry syrup characteristic that I had mentioned previously. And on day 49, final notes we have through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee was back to being the best it had been since that first impression. Now, it wasn't as good as that first impression, but it was as close as it had been, as it's still offering a very nice level of berry sweetness and complementary traces of the plum-like stone fruit qualities and characteristics as well. Plenty of hibiscus and a slight grapefruit bitterness with more of the fruit forward characteristics, including that cherry fruit. So while I didn't get that same level of peachy quality that I'd gotten on that first try, it was a little bit closer in the rest of the characteristics that we experienced on this day. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see where we're heading. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. That can usually be an extremely big deal when it comes to Kenyan coffees, because I said if they have too many tomato-like characteristics to it, then it's hard for me to justify putting them there at the level 4 mark. But for me, this one had a very clean base to it, and yes, there was a little bit of savoriness. I didn't mention it too much, largely because it wasn't as abundant as some of the other Kenyan coffees that we were working on with this one simultaneously. Even then, notable enough to the point where we kept it there at the level 4 mark, very clean for a Kenyan coffee. Finish, level 4. Definitely has that lingering, long-lasting red fruit quality to this one. Very tart in the finish, a lot of what you'd expect for a Kenyan coffee, a little bit of those red florals as well. And I guess we'll just kind of elaborate on that when we get to the rest of the qualities within this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. That is the biggest victory for me when it came to this coffee, as it's not too often that I find Kenyan coffees to have the combination of both the cleanliness and the sweetness scoring there at that level 4 for me specifically. I get that in theory, Kenyan coffees are supposed to offer both of those traits and characteristics, but oftentimes I can find the savoriness taking away from them too much. But this one, having that sort of red cherry fruit chew quality to it, the additional other red qualities in terms of the fruit sense, like that cranberry, presenting sweet enough to the point where we can justify that level 4 for sweetness. It was never in jeopardy. It was never in doubt. One of the sweeter Kenyan coffees I've had this year. Acidity level 4, very straightforward. It is a wash processed Kenyan coffee. I usually don't feel the need to discuss too much of the finish or sweetness or acidity when it comes to Kenyan coffees, because as I always say, if they're not a level 4 minimum, something went horribly wrong with this coffee. Nothing went horribly wrong with this one. Very bright throughout the entirety of it. Florality level 4, plenty of those hibiscus-like characteristic, very common with what we'd experienced from something like this. Berry fruit level 4, that is another really enjoyable aspect of this coffee, because rather than just looking at it as straightforward currants, cranberry sort of characteristics to it, it did have a sweeter, more like red berry compote sort of feel. I think that's the note they have listed on here, is berry compote, but I aligned it being a little bit more reminiscent of like a berry syrup, given that it has a little bit of texture, it has a little bit of thickness to it, and it has plenty of that sweetness to go alongside that as well, which made it for a very, I don't want to say unique, but slightly different and enjoyable berry experience to this coffee. Handful of level 3s, we will go ahead and start with the citrus fruit level 3. I mentioned a slightly bitter grapefruit quality and characteristic to it. Even then, it does present in a sweeter sense too, so I don't mind the citric qualities and characteristics to this one. Just gave it a little bit more depth. Stone fruit level 3. If I could have gotten that peach quality throughout the entirety of this coffee, then I think you probably know how highly I would have rated this coffee. But even then, it's very nice. There's Plenty of those plum characteristics to it. Recently I've been having more plums and I can see a little bit more tartness to them, so a little bit of that as well. Caramel level 3, mentioned there's that syrupy quality to this one, which I very much enjoy. That is what the caramel is in this one. A little bit of that darker, more molasses-like characteristic to it. And then final thing we're discussing, well, two more things we're discussing. Body level 3, more juicy, medium-bodied cup of coffee, fully expected with something like this. And then the final thing we're discussing, I'll touch on this briefly, we have the savoriness there to level 2. There is tomato to it, and maybe I could say that this one's on the slightly higher side of the level 2, but I think it seems to dissipate as you're drinking this coffee, as it doesn't really have a lot of tomato now within the finish after it has cooled down. So for me, it was fine leaving it there at level 2 and not having that hinder the cleanliness that we had experienced from this coffee. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It has been extremely consistent with the experiences that we have had from Big Sur up to this point, which has been that they are more fruit forward and sweet forward than what we usually experience from a lot of their contemporaries as well. In addition to that, they can be a little bit inconsistent and fickle, and adjusting the coffees can seem to yield significantly different results. That being said, based off of that first impression, I really wanted to continue to replicate that, and it's always frustrating when you get such a wonderful first impression of a coffee and you're continuing to chase that experience throughout the entirety of it, wanting to get that same sort of high, but I could not get that with this coffee, and that's a little bit frustrating given that was one of the best experiences I've had from any Kenyan coffee that we've reviewed, not just this year, but within the last couple of years, and I really wanted to continue to get that throughout the entirety of this one, as it would have been a very strong contender for being one of my favorite coffees throughout the entirety of the year. Even then, it definitely is on my favorite side of Kenyan coffees that I've had this year, largely because it offers much more of the characteristics that I do look for within Kenyan coffee. So it is less tomato forward, it is a little cleaner, it is a little sweeter, and it does offer a unique fruit characteristic to it as well. That's just basically my overall sentiment of this coffee. I'm kind of curious to see how some of their other Kenyan offerings might turn out, as I really wanted to get some more, but this is the only one that they did have. Even then, I found myself gravitating towards these SL28 coffees, because usually when it comes to my favorite coffees that I've had from Kenya throughout the year, it's going to be just a straight SL28, SL34, that sort of varietal coffee that I enjoy the most. So it was a very enjoyable experience to have this one, and at the end of the day, I am very happy with the way that it did turn out. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I still think that there are two distinct camps when it comes to wash processed Kenyan coffee drinkers, as some do really like that prominent, savory, red fruit, tomato-like characteristic to it. And then there are people like myself that seem to try to avoid those qualities as much as possible and really want to lean into the more fruit and sweeter qualities of these Kenyan coffees, as it's still Kenyan. I mean, if you put this coffee alongside 100 other coffees that weren't Kenyan, you'd be able to tell that this coffee was Kenyan, but it can be balanced out really well if it's offering enough of the other qualities and characteristics to make it a very enjoyable experience for me. And that was the case with this one, as I do find myself enjoying the brightness and enjoying the tartness of coffees like this when they are well balanced by the rest of the characteristics, like the sweetness, like the florality, and like those fruit components. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Thiriku AA wash processed Kenya from Big Sur Coffee. Thank you for watching.